It's a transformational program that's been designed over more than 40 years.
And so I scheduled to go to this place in Sedona, Arizona,
with multiple scientific studies published in major research journals.
With this man for 39 years has been a neurological expert about how to wire your brain.
That have confirmed the benefits, and as the protocols have evolved, the training becomes more powerful.
For alpha states, delta states, if you're familiar with those. My dear friend, Dr. Jim Hardt, and his Biocybernaut program is extraordinary. I've been through it myself. My wife Sage has, members of my family have, and we found it to be truly extraordinary.
Hey everybody, welcome to Tech for Psych, where we combine the latest in neurotechnology with ancient wisdom to supercharge your brain. Today I'm sitting down with Dr. Jim Hardt. He's got background in physics and psychology and is a legend in the neurofeedback community. Dr. Hardt's been developing his technology and his techniques in the Biocybernaut Institute for over 40 years. He's been on programs such as Larry King Live and has been highly recommended from very high profile people to include the author, entrepreneur, and self-help coach Tony Robbins.
And the entire time you are learning to think, and how you think, these electrodes create sounds. And you learn how to put yourself in the zone of alpha.
We talked about a wide range of topics to include brainwaves and neurofeedback and the origin of those discoveries, the Biocybernaut philosophy, as well as a new wearable that will be coming out from Biocybernaut within the next year.
The computer can see things that are going on that, shall we say, escape the naked eye and that escape the conscious mind. This year, we will be introducing for under $500 a personal portable wearable device that uses this second parameter. And so for under $500, people will be able to make rapid progress using the second most powerful parameter to increase alpha.
So stick around, and I hope you enjoy my interview with Dr. Jim Hardt. Dr. Hardt, thanks so much for being on the program with me. The reviews about you over the years are incredibly impressive. You know, people like Tony Robbins recommending you, some of the more famous examples. And, you know, you've been around for some time, and I'd love to hear about how you started Biocybernaut and what your background is and how all this got started.
Oh, wonderful. Happy to share that with you. Well, let's talk about brainwaves. Brainwaves. Brainwaves, the existence of electrical waves in the brain, were discovered in 1908 by an Austrian psychiatrist named Herr Dr. Hans Berger. And it was a super cool story. He had been born in Bavaria, and which had mystical roots. When René Descartes dreamed up science and famously said, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, it defined beingness in terms of whether you were thinking or not. So all the non-thinking, non-rational forms of consciousness, like intuition, were suppressed, vigorously suppressed, pretty much all across Europe, except in Bavaria. Bavaria had deep mystical roots and held on to it. So Hans Berger grew up in a culture, unlike the rest of Europe around him, which was open to mystical experiences and to intuition. Okay, so then he goes to school and he becomes a psychiatrist and he's practicing in Vienna. And so the Austro-Hungarian Empire was continually fighting wars in the Crimea. And he was drafted because he was educated. He was given a horse and made an officer. And in a battle, one of the interminable wars in the Crimea, his horse was shot, fell on, and broke his leg. So he spent long in a militarisches Krankenhaus, which is a military hospital. And there being, of course, no internet, cell phones, whatever, his family had very little idea what was happening to him. So months later, he's released. He goes back to Vienna, and he calls all his family together. And he starts telling them this story, the battle and the horse getting shot, falling on him, breaking his leg, stuff like that. And so halfway through his story, his sister interrupts him, takes him into her bedroom, and pulls out her Tagebuch, which is daybook or diary. And in it, she shows him there's an exact description of absolutely everything that happened to him. So suddenly, this scientist, psychiatrist, now believes in the existence of ESP because that's his sister. And there written down is his entire story. So he had heard about animal magnetism and animal electricity. Like in France, Volta was taking little cells and putting them on frogs' legs, and they would jump.
Mm-hmm.
And he guessed that there might be electrical waves in the brain. Technology was very primitive in 1908, but he went looking. And, it would fall to another tale to describe this incredibly elaborate and primitive device that he used to detect electrical waves in the brain. Well, the first one that he found, he called alpha because it was first. It's not the fastest, it's not the slowest, but it's the biggest. And so it was obviously going to be the one that was discovered by his very primitive, weak amplifiers. So because he thought it was somehow related to the secret of ESP, he kept the discovery a secret for 10 years, from 1908 to 1918. And then he published. And of course, it created a sensation. Oh my God, electrical waves in the brain. And pretty soon brain labs spring up all over Europe, Moscow, London, Berlin, Vienna, and then in the United States, and then it moved to Australia and things like Canada, places like that. And so from 1918 until 1962, there were a lot of scientific studies about these brainwaves. Nobody ever tried to do feedback on them because they were thought to be part of the autonomic nervous system, and thus the belief was incapable of voluntary control. Okay? Well, in 1962, a Japanese-American scientist, Dr. Joe Kamiya, had moved from University of Chicago to University of California, San Francisco, and he was doing sleep research. And so he'd have a pretty co-ed lying on a cot right next to the polygraph machine, recording brainwaves and, encouraging her to fall asleep. Well, as she relaxed, he would notice that there would be bursts of alpha waves. And so he would say, oh, wow, there's a big alpha wave. And it would almost immediately be followed by another. So he began to wonder if somehow his reporting the existence of an alpha wave was somehow triggering another one. So then he would ring a little bell and found that that seemed also to increase the alpha. So then he made a primitive electronic system where if alpha occurred, a tone would come on. And so he confirmed, to his utter astonishment, because all scientists knew that brainwaves were not voluntarily controllable. They knew it. Okay, that was the paradigm of science. And so in April of 1962, he made a report at the Western Psychological Association meeting in San Francisco about humans' ability to voluntarily control their brainwaves. Well, that kicked off a firestorm of interest. Electronic Zen, and oh my God. But the problem was most people didn't understand how to do it. And so when I came into the field in the early 70s, 90% of all the published papers showed that people could not learn to increase their alpha brainwaves above an eyes closed, just resting baseline. So in the way I found out about this was, it was the fall semester in 1967. I was a senior in physics at Carnegie Institute of Technology, and I came out of the student union to be met by a huge colorful sign, hand-painted, where every letter was a slightly different color. And the sign said, Dr. Joe Kamiya will talk on brainwaves and consciousness, and it gave a time, which, oh my God, that's just 10 minutes from now. It was at Margaret Morrison College, which was, just a 2-minute walk over here, and I did not have a class that hour. So I went. And Joe had come to visit a woman. He was in transit from Washington, D.C., where he's funding through DARPA. The military was right on this very quickly and wanted to know how we could make better soldiers and sailors with brain training. And I'll go and make an aside there. Monitoring radar screens, you have to catch a blip if it shows up. And if you get drowsy, you might miss it. So they were interested in using brain training to suppress theta waves, which are associated with stage 1 or stage 2 of sleep. So, we're not talking about anything violent. We're talking about, functionality, improving performance, things like that. And so this woman was a painting and design teacher at the Fine Arts College associated with Carnegie Institute of Technology. And her students had made the signs, put them all over campus. And I was the only person from the engineering college that went. All the other people were this woman's students. And they were a little clueless. They were asking about alpha rays, which are helium nuclei stripped of electrons, 2 protons, 2 neutrons. And they didn't understand that alpha waves were an electrical and a magnetic signal emanating from the brain. But there was a mob of people around Dr. Kamiya at the end of the talk. I waited my turn and then spoke with him. Now, I was in the habit then of going to San Francisco every summer. I'd ride my motorcycle out or, whatever. And so I said, Dr. Kamiya, I'm going to be in San Francisco this summer. Could I come and see you? He said, oh, absolutely. And I go, could we correspond? And he said, well, no, I'm really too busy. I said, well, how about if I send you letters and I have like 5 or 6 sentences and then a blank space. And if you want to reply, you can write in a few words and just send it back. He thought that was a great idea. So we began this correspondence. Meanwhile, I went to the library and started reading everything I could find on brainwaves and Xeroxing the articles. So by spring, I had a big stack of articles like this, and I'd read everything 3 times. And it was all that was known about brainwaves up until that time. And of course, none of this had to do with feedback on brainwaves. It was mostly psychophysics. For example, if you put somebody in a dark room and have a screen in front of them, and you project a square of light that's 2 inches by 2 inches, and you have an illuminance of, so many candle power. If you double the size of the area and keep the luminance the same, it will reduce alpha by the same amount as if you make the thing smaller and double the luminance. So the area times the luminance is what determines the amount of alpha blocking. So there were studies like that. Mm-hmm. Also, it was learned, for example, that the smell of musk will suppress alpha, whereas the smell of lavender will increase it. And so, and for most people, mental arithmetic, eyes closed mental arithmetic would lower alpha, things like that, psychophysics. So, but now there's a new game, which is giving people feedback. Well, a lot of the people doing the feedback didn't have the extensive library of knowledge that I had because I'd read everything about what makes alpha work and not work. So when I designed studies, I designed them in such a way that I would optimize and not undermine the brain's natural ability to make alpha. Like a lot of the studies were done eyes open. Well, that's like trying to teach a bird to fly with a boulder tied around its leg. Okay? Or maybe they would do lying down, which puts people into drowsiness, and you have theta instead of alpha. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of simple methodological problems. Or like Jackson Beatty, a scientist, one time did a study where he'd have somebody sit in a chair, and for 8 seconds, they would get alpha feedback. Then they'd have to jump up and run around the room and sit back down and do another 8 seconds. And of course, they never learned. It was almost as though the people were unconsciously afraid of the profound altered states of consciousness, like advanced meditation, that will occur when you produce very high alpha waves. And so the scientists who were trying to stay in the logical, rational, analytical mode of consciousness sort of unconsciously designed their studies to prevent people from having these far out experiences. And so it's now the spring, end of the spring semester. I graduate with my degree in physics. I get on my Triumph motorcycle and I ride up into Canada, across the continent on the Trans-Canadian Highway and down the west coast to San Francisco, where Joe is. And I show up at his lab and volunteer as a research subject. And it's pretty, the feedback system is pretty primitive, although they have a bedroom. It's a house at the edge of campus. They have a large bedroom with a huge computer. It's called a mini computer. It was a PDP-15 by Digital Equipment Corp. And that ran the feedback. But the actual chamber was a closet off the bedroom with a hard wooden chair, a torn speaker sitting on an orange crate in the corner of the room for one audio feedback channel, and Nixie tubes with a 3-digit display. Do you know what Nixie tubes are?
I do not, no.
Okay. Well, you know what vacuum tubes are, right?
Yeah, I remember that.
Pre-transistor. Well, the Nixie tube would have 10 filaments, one shaped like a 0, one shaped like a 1, another like a 2. And depending on which pins you powered on the bottom of the tube, the 1 would glow or the 7 would glow. And so you could give digital feedback in the dark. And Joe knew enough to be doing the feedback in the dark. So they put one electrode in the middle of the back of my head, the ground on the forehead, and a reference electrode on the ear, monopolar recording. And I had maybe an hour of feedback where there'd be 2 minutes of audio where anytime the alpha emerged, the tone would get louder as the alpha got bigger. If the alpha got smaller, the tone would get quieter. And then every 2 minutes, the tone would stop and this 3-digit score would light up. Well, I went back the next day and the next day. It was the most fascinating thing I'd ever done in my life. And so I went back on the 4th day wanting more. And to my great disappointment, they weren't doing any studies. Mm-hmm. But I learned a little how the lab worked. And Joe's California girlfriend, a woman named Joanne Gardner, who later became his wife, was working in the lab. So I went to Joanne's office and I said, Joanne, I understand you're not doing any studies today. She goes, that's right. I said, would you take me downstairs and put the electrodes on me, put me in the chamber so I can play? And she said, oh, sure. So she does that. She didn't start the paper and ink writing polygraph because I wasn't going to be anybody's data. But she did turn on the big computer. She loaded the program, which was on punched paper tape. That's how data input in those days. And then she put me in the chamber, plugged me in, left, went upstairs. She forgot I was there. Later, lunchtime came, and she and 9 other members of the lab, everybody at the lab, went out to a 12-course Chinese lunch. And in course 11, she goes, oh my God. And they remembered, they all rush out of the restaurant, race back across town in Paul Gorman's VW camper van, and rush into the building, rip open the door, and interrupt the late stages of a most incredible adventure. When I went into the chamber, I was a Protestant fundamentalist physics major. I had never done any drugs. I hadn't even been drunk, so I didn't know what altered states were. And so my experiences as the alpha increased about 10 times the starting level. I had out-of-body experience, ego disintegration. I was flying all around the universe. I was meeting up with discorporate entities, one of which was scary. And this was not anything I'd ever studied, read about. Mm-hmm. I didn't even know what meditation was. As I said, I was my dad's father had been a Lutheran minister who married my parents and baptized me. And even though I was told I had 2 Jewish great-grandmothers, I was raised Protestant. And so this was way outside anything. And I was so high that for about 3 days I walked around and it was like my feet didn't touch the ground. But then, pretty soon summer is over and I have to ride my motorcycle back to Pittsburgh. I had decided that somehow, I didn't know how, but I was going to be involved in weird stuff. And I wanted to get my rational mind stamped with some form of approval. So I thought a master's degree and a PhD in psychology would be a good thing. So I show up at what is now Carnegie Mellon, because it joined with Mellon Institute over the summer. I show up at the psych department and said, I'd like to be a grad student. And they loved me because in my senior year, I'd set up an exchange program, even though I was a physics major. I'd set up an exchange program between the psych department at Carnegie Tech and Duquesne University, where they had some French Jesuits who were, teaching phenomenology, and a lot of my professors in Carnegie Tech were behaviorists, rat runners. They didn't even believe in consciousness. And here the guys at Duquesne are studying the structure of consciousness. And so it was a little bit of, shall we say, as the British might say, controversy. And anyway, some of the professors there really liked me and they gave me a scholarship. And so I started the master's program. Well, I wanted to go back to San Francisco. So I wrote and won pretty quickly a pre-doctoral fellowship. So 1 year later, 68, I had my master's degree in psychology. And I went back to San Francisco with my pre-doctoral fellowship, and I started doing research in Joe Knie's lab. And so that's when I'm working on my doctorate. This is when I realized I had to reform the field because, as I said, 90% of all the published studies were showing that people could not learn to increase their alpha. And so there was a journal called Biofeedback and Self-Regulation. And with Joe Camille as my co-author, second author, I wrote a paper called Integrated Amplitude versus, paper was called Conflicting Results in EEG Feedback Training, why integrated amplitude should replace percent time. Now, much of the field, almost all of it, was using a percent time measure. So here you have your alpha waves. They would arbitrarily set an amplitude threshold. And if the alpha would go above that, they'd turn on a tone. If alpha went way above that, you would just hear that same tone. It wouldn't get louder. If alpha dropped below that level, the tone would go off. If it dropped way below, the tone would still be off. So it was very limited information. And my studies of the waveform showed that that measure suffered from something called gauge variance. It was actually, a simple way, is a rubber ruler. It measures differently at different ranges of the scale. And in some cases actually correlates negatively with measures of the energy in the waveform. That's what I was promoting. Our scores now are actually the square root of energy, and the units are microvolt seconds. So then I began a program of research. So at one point, I think in 1984, Michael Hutchison, who had something called the Megabrain Report, asked me to write down the details of my experience. And so I published a paper in 1984 in Megabrain Report on that. But I want to jump back a little because I rode my motorcycle back to Pittsburgh. I went to the psych department. I registered for grad school. And they said, yeah, you're accepted. Here's a scholarship. And so the professor from Duquesne, who was a social psychological phenomenologist that I had connected with in order to do this exchange between the Carnegie Tech Psych Department and the Duquesne Psych Department, he and I had become friends. And he lived right near the Carnegie campus up on a hill in what we would call a robber baron era house. You know, there was a period in Pittsburgh where the robber barons, the early capitalist industrialists, built these huge mansions. Like the top floor had living quarters for 11 maids.
Wow.
This was a huge house. And so, and Dr. Rolf von Eckertsburg had been a grad student at Harvard under Timothy Leary. You know, Timothy Leary, who famously, along with Dr. Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass, they were both thrown out of Harvard when the more conservative professors freaked out about their experiments with psychedelics.
Right.
Timothy Leary continued to be a gadfly promoting, LSD, scared the establishment. Somebody planted 6 marijuana seeds in the carpet of the passenger side of his car, and that was their excuse to put him in jail for 20 years. And when he got out, he died shortly thereafter. Whereas Dr. Alpert took a different path. He went to India, linked up with Bhagwan Das, who took him to Neem Karoli Baba, who became his guru. And then with the incredible speaking abilities and language and psychological knowledge of a Harvard professor of psychology, Ram Dass, who just died.
Yeah, I did hear about that.
Educated about 3 generations of Westerners about the philosophy and the psychology of yoga. And he was a very important teacher for me. So anyway, Rolf is a really turned-on guy. He's done tons of LSD. He and his wife, had 3 beautiful children. And I go to tell him about this experience, this thing that had happened to me in Joe's lab. It's still pretty fresh. And I walk into his office in this big mansion, and he looks at me, and he could see I was profoundly different. And he takes one hand, and he sweeps everything off his desk, clears the desk, and he motions like, sit down. So I sit down across the desk, and he folds his hand, and he says, okay, tell me, what's happened to you? So for about the next 3.5 hours, I go through every detail. Now, partway through my retelling of this story, one of his neighbor ladies walked in behind him, stood respectfully in the distance, listened to me for maybe 20 minutes. Then she disappeared. She came back 5 minutes later with a book, and she walked around Rolf's desk and put the book right at my side. It was the Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramahansa Yogananda. Now, a month earlier, I'd looked at it, read a few paragraphs, and said, this is nonsense, and I would have tossed it. Well, I was different. And so, anyway, I actually shared this with my roommate, who was a grad student at Duquesne in the psychology department. And he ordered the Yogananda correspondence lessons, and we started, studying yoga. Eventually, initiated into Kriya Yoga by one of Yogananda's direct disciples, Swami Kriyananda, at the Ananda Cooperative Village in Grass Valley, California. So at the end of this recounting of this fabulous set of experiences, Rolf goes like this, and he goes, "We can do that here." And it was like all the pieces fell into place. It was like fragments of DNA, molecules floating around, amino acids. All of a sudden, boom, they came together, and there was the double helix. And I had not a job, not a career, not a profession. I had a vocation in that instant. And I just registered for psychology. They had one soundproof chamber there and a big pile of old junky electronics. And I knew with my physics ability, I could cobble together a system where I could do brainwave feedback there at Carnegie Mellon University. And so that's what I did. I wanted to do my doctoral dissertation on alpha feedback. And so I was told to go talk to Dr. Terrence W. Barrett, who was a postdoc, and this was his first job. I was told he was in charge of the physiological laboratory. Well, the year was 1971 now, and I had read a book by Charles Hardt called Altered States of Consciousness, which, including a paper by Joe Kamiya, had a paper on the brainwaves of the yogic superconscious state called Samadhi,
right,
and superconscious state in Zen, which is called Satori. Now, in both of these superconscious states, there's super high alpha all over the head. But there's one big difference. In yoga philosophy, everything in the phenomenal world is referred to as Maya, or an illusion. And the yogis pretty much ignore that and go on a search within for the greater reality. In fact, you'll find a yogi sitting skinny, starving, covered with lice on the side of the road, absorbed in an incredible bliss state. Whereas in Japan, the bullet trains run on time. They have these enormous clean rooms where they grow these ultra pure silicon wafers and, cut them and put them on chips, dominate the semiconductor industry. Very different culture, India and Japan. And I would submit that much of the differences are due to the differences in the superconscious state, Samadhi in India and Satori in Zen. Here's an example. In the paper on Samadhi, they would take, for example, a yogi sitting in Samadhi, and they would bring a pair of cymbals up near his ears and clash them together. Well, with you or me, if they were making alpha, the alpha would go away. It's called blocking. The startle would block alpha. After a while, it would come back. But with the yogi and Samadhi, clash, unrippled. Then they would take a branding iron, heat it up in a fire, and put it on the yogi's arm so the flesh was burning and the smoke was curling up, unbroken alpha. Then they would take that arm, and this would reduce the scarring, and put the arm in a bucket of ice water. It's called cold pressor test. Actually, a bucket of ice cubes. Now, most people could maybe handle 10 minutes, maybe 5 minutes of that. Half an hour later, the yogi's alpha is unbroken. Okay. Now, so the real world that we call real doesn't exist. The yogi's body is there, but his consciousness is absorbed in a higher reality. And so what goes on in the phenomenal world doesn't matter that much in that view. Whereas now let's take a Zen monk in Satori. You don't have to use a pair of cymbals. You can take a little tinkle bell and hold it up by the ear and go tinkle, tinkle, and the alpha will block. Comes back, you hold up the bell, tinkle, tinkle, and alpha blocks. Now, if that were you or me, after you do it 6 or 8 or 10 times, tinkle, tinkle, the brain goes, oh, it's that bell again. It's not dangerous. It's not interesting. and the brain habituates.
Right.
It does block. The 1,000th time you ring the bell for the Zen guy in Satori, the alpha will block. There's a British poet named William Blake who wrote famously, "When the doors of perception are cleansed, everything appears to man as it is, namely infinite." And so there was actually a rock group called the Doors. They were named after the doors of perception. And so everything appears to man as it is. So the 1,000th time you ring the bell, it's fresh and new. I think it was Heraclitus of Ephesus, a scholar writing at the dawn of the Athenian Golden Age, who said, you can never step into the same river twice. And so you go, oh, okay, well, the rivers run downstream. So you step in the river and then you run downstream and you step in. But it's an older river. Some of the microorganisms died in that moment. Some have divided on mitosis. And so you can never step into the same river twice. And so from this exalted perspective of Satori, everything is fresh and new. Okay, so that's some of the data on brainwaves and consciousness. So I'm going to Dr. Barrett's office seeking permission to use the electrophysiological lab. And I tell him excitedly, this data about brainwaves and Samadhi and brainwaves and Satori. And he's fairly impassive, doesn't say much. Later that day, I get a letter in my mailbox, the psych department, within the department mailbox system. And he says, permission to use the equipment denied.
Wow.
He wants to say nobody who's interested in consciousness could possibly be serious about getting a PhD in physiological psychology. However, if you will abandon these silly notions and submit yourself to me, I will design a program of research which will lead to a PhD in physiological psychology. I go, wow, academic freedom, huh?
Yeah.
So fortunately, the dean of the department was on sabbatical. And the acting dean was Dr. Richard Hayes, who was a Piagetian developmental psychologist. He was probably the only guy in the department that was studying anything related to consciousness. So I took the letter to Dr. Richard Hayes, Dick Hayes. He looked at it and he didn't say anything, but his eyebrows went up. And later, I think it was the next day, I got a letter from him saying that I would be allowed to use the laboratory. But this earned me the enmity of the hard-nosed behaviorist rat runner psychologists in the department, and they were gunning for me. Fortunately, most of the work I did was out at Joe Camilla's lab in San Francisco. And so I was able to do the work, but against heavy opposition.
What do you think it is about the alpha state that elicits these states of mind? You mentioned that you studied these people that have had decades of experience in meditation, that they produce these waves. Do you have any opinion on like how exactly getting into an alpha state actually changes someone so profoundly in intelligence, memory, and having these experiences?
Well, Tony Robbins recently said publicly, there's no problem that can't be solved in a higher alpha state. Mm-hmm. And so how does that work? Well, we could go all the way in answering your question. We could go all the way back to about the 1880s when psychology began studying various kinds of performance, including ability to memorize things. Mm-hmm. And what they found was that anxiety impaired performance, physical performance, and mental performance. In fact, last year, we trained a young man a skier in Canada, who his performance in races is pretty poor, but his performance in practice is Olympic quality. So we trained him and his coach in alpha, and now we're seeing, what kind of a difference that makes. But anyway, the idea is that all the way back in the 1880s, the science of psychology knew that anxiety impaired performance. Well, how do you get rid of anxiety? Well, first of all, if we go all the way back to Dr. Hans Berger, in those 10 years where he secretly studied alpha brainwaves, one of the things he learned was that alpha was lower in high anxiety people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in fact, I had a major publication in Science Magazine, one of the top 2 general science journals in the world. The other one is the British journal Nature. And on the 7th day of the 7th month in 1978, I published a paper showing that learning to increase alpha will lower both kinds of anxiety. State anxiety, which is transitory of the moment, but also it would lower trait anxiety, which is a personality disposition. Now, according to psychology and psychiatry, most of them believe that personality is stable over the adult lifespan. And if you're willing to do 20 years of psychotherapy, maybe you could tinker at the margins a little bit, with the problem. But let's not even talk about trying to change core dimensions of personality. And I'll tell you an amusing and sad story that illustrates that. So I'm at UCSF, and I'm an assistant research psychologist, but then I write and win a large federal grant that was entitled from National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH. Mm-hmm. And it was entitled Anxiety and Aging, Intervention with EEG Alpha Feedback. And it turns out, and we can talk about this later, you can actually reverse aspects of aging in the brain by doing this training. And you can ask me a question later and I'll give you the details. But anyway, when I won this large grant, suddenly I'm promoted from an assistant research psychologist to an assistant professor of medical psychology in the psychiatry department. Shortly after that, the chairman of the department issued a decree that there would be an annual faculty retreat. Every member of this august body, the psychiatry faculty, would have to get together on a weekend, get up on a stage, and spend 10 minutes explaining their research to all the other faculty members. I was very excited to do this because before I would do any of my trainings, I would give the MMPI, personality test. It stands for Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. And it's the granddaddy of personality test. It was standardized in 1945 on 10,000 Americans. Mm-hmm. It's super reliable, a little dated, but it's got 8 clinical scales and 3 life scales. One life scale detects trying to fake bad, another detects trying to fake good, and another was just generally not telling the truth. And some of the clinical scales are actually statistically corrected based on the life scale. So there's mathematical and psychological sophistication deeply embedded in this test. And if you show a printed profile where 50 percentile is normal and between 70 and 30 is considered the normal range, if you take somebody in the 80th or the 90th percentile, they're pretty disturbed people. And a psychiatrist or a psychologist can look at the printed MMPI profile and just start telling you all about that person. It's a very good test. So I was giving this test before and after to students doing the alpha training in my part of Joe Camilla's lab. And I was seeing people in the 98th and the 98th percentile of depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, paranoia, a week later be in the normal zone. And so I thought this would be really fun to show. So I was showing slides of the pre and the post, 7-8 days apart. Well, I'm only halfway through my talk, and I was interrupted by shouting, yelling. There were 2 senior bearded members of the department were out of their seats, shaking their fist, waving their finger, and yelling. Now, we use an emotional hierarchy that starts with apathy at the bottom, sadness or depression, anger, fear, and joy. Mm-hmm. And so if you're blocking your fears, what'll come out is you'll act angry. If you're not admitting that you're angry, you'll be demonstrating sadness. And so these guys were angry. So what I knew was they were afraid that this young whippersnapper was going to disrupt their profession with a technology that would do in 7 days what they weren't able to do in 20 years, which is profoundly help people to profoundly alter core dimensions of personality. And so I was shouted off the stage. I was able to conduct
and over the years, you've seen this time and time again with your clients, it sounds like. And I wanted to ask you how the program has shaped over the years. Has there been iterations of Biocybernaut that have really come to where it's at now? I'd be curious to hear about that.
Wonderful question. Yes. The first study I did for my doctoral dissertation was done in 1971 at Carnegie Mellon University. And I trained 20 male college students. I had learned, for example, that the amount of alpha is profoundly reduced in the premenstrual week in females. And so I chose to work with males because, even if a woman knew when her period was due, if it came early, I'd have to throw out of the database and run somebody else. And so I was working with college-age males. And I administered to about 150 of them the MMPI. And the first factor is Welsh anxiety. And I took the 10 most anxious and the 10 least anxious. I didn't know which they were. I had somebody else, select the study was single blind. The federal grant was actually double blind. And so I didn't know which were the high anxiety, which were the low anxiety, but I knew there were two different groups. And I had another grad student, go through the test and pick them. Now, the way academic psychologists get research subjects is they make it a requirement in your psychology courses that you have to participate in a certain number of hours of psychological research. And so I would go to psychology classes and give my pitch. The students there, had to sign up for some studies. And so I'd give my pitch, and the ones that wanted to, I would give them a little, reminder. And then they would be the ones that would come for training. But I only had an hour a day with them. So in 1 hour, I had to have them take a couple of mood scales, on a clipboard and a pencil. I had to put on a few electrodes. I had to put them in the chamber, do a baseline or two, give them feedback, have them do another mood scale, and then interview them all within an hour. So there was on that hour, there was only 20 minutes available to do feedback. So at the end of 7 days, and I had guidance right from the beginning, the training should be 7 days, they only got 140 minutes of feedback. And in that, only 12% of the high anxiety people learned to increase alpha above their resting baseline. All the low anxiety people, increased. But the 12% of the high anxiety that increased their alpha became low anxiety. Oh, that's pretty cool. So then I moved out on my pre-doctoral fellowship to California and then Joe Camilla's lab, and I repeat the study, making it much better. Again, 20 people, 10 high anxiety, 10 low. And now, instead of 140 minutes of feedback, people are getting many hours of feedback. I wasn't limited. And so in this study, 50% of the high anxiety people, not 12, 50% learned to increase their alpha above their initial eyes closed resting baseline, and they all became low anxiety. So then I did a further revision where, I improved the technology, improved my coaching methods, and I did much longer times of training, and I got it to the point where 100% of the high anxiety people would learn to increase their alpha above their eyes closed resting baseline, and they would become low anxiety. And so this was the data that I was showing to the psychiatry department professors. And so, the technology has evolved over time, and so have my skills and abilities. Another answer to your question is that when I first started doing the work, about 1 in 20 would have anything like a profound spiritual experience. They would have massive insights, life-changing insights, but profound spiritual experiences were only about 1 in 20. So working in the university for about 15 years, I doubled that to 1 in 10. I improved the technology, I improved the training protocols, and I improved my coaching abilities. And all of these are incredibly relevant to success. I'll give you an example. One time recently, in the last 10 years, one of my engineers had a complete set of my technology in his lab because he was writing software for me. And without telling me, he gave 100 sessions to his business partner who, shall we say, was sort of in need of some help. And 100 sessions with there were no mood scales. There was no debriefing. It didn't use my protocols. And after 100 sessions, nothing beneficial happened. And so at Biocybernaut, people don't come for neurofeedback training, and that's part of it. For example, you go to a restaurant um, and you have, a 9-course meal and a dessert, an appetizer. Well, most people don't go just for the dessert. They go for the whole thing. And so neurofeedback is a part of what we do at Biocybernaut, but it's only one part. It's a transformational program that's been designed over more than 40 years with multiple scientific studies published in major research journals that have confirmed the benefits. And as the protocols have evolved, the training becomes more powerful. In 2008, I moved to Canada and set up the Biocybernaut Institute of Canada. And in December of that year, I trained one of the co-founders of Canada's second largest oil and gas company, who with one partner had grown the company from zero to $2 billion in just 2 years. He's an incredibly astute businessman. He loved the training so much that he took $6 million of personal money and set up a scholarship fund.
Wow.
Some for people from his company. And he said that the ROI, or the return on investment, of a Biocybernaut training was 100. He would send an employee for training, pay for the airfare and the hotel, the taxi, and the training fee. And the employee that he got back, he felt was 100 times more valuable than the one he sent. So the ROI, he said, was 100. Very astute businessman saying something incredibly powerful. But he also had a great compassion for the Canadian Aboriginals. In America, they're called American Indians. They prefer to be called Aboriginals or First Nations people. And they're deeply traumatized, in some cases as bad as returning war veterans, because of the intense racism and the residential school system, where children were ripped away from their parents or grandparents and sent to these 12 months a year schools, where many of them died, most of them were raped, and so it was pretty traumatizing. This system was finally ended in 1989. So we trained over 200 of these people. At one point, I was invited to speak at the United Nations in Geneva about the results. I trained many famous chiefs, shaman, medicine men and women. And at one point, I wrote a paper published in a medical journal, Advances in Mind-Body Medicine. The paper was entitled Reduction in Psychopathology in a Cohort of Male and Female Canadian Aboriginals. I'm going to hold up a copy of the journal. There we have Advances in Mind-Body Medicine, and there's the title page.
And you bring up a theme that I wanted to ask you about, is the theme of trauma and how this can have profound effects on people that have had trauma in their life, and how that theme comes into the training. I was curious to hear more about that, how brainwaves could actually help overcome.
Well, again, remember my software engineer who gave his business partner 100 sessions with my technology, didn't do the depth interviews, didn't have the extended protocols that we use. People are here at the training center typically at least 12 hours a day. And then the debriefing. When an astronaut comes back from a space mission, they don't take him out to pizza. A group of experts gather around and quiz him or her about every detail of the mission. And because if they don't do that, details will be quickly forgotten. Okay, and so the debriefing is an extremely important part, as are the mood scales. Now, I wrote the mood scale program first to just administer the mood scales, so we'd have them scored right away instead of paper and pencil. But later, I developed the mood scales so that the computer program can actually read the existence of unconscious emotions. And so, if you have unconscious positive emotions, that's a waste. It's like having a bank account in your name. You don't know it's there, can't use it. And the negative unconscious emotions sabotage your happiness, your health, and your performance. And so by the computer program can identify the unconscious emotions and then the facilitator, the trainer, goes over these with the person. And let's say there's a word there like angry, or furious, or hopeless, or sad, or terrified. When the facilitator asks about these words that are identified as people denied feeling that, but the computer can see it in them, because they do the mood scales while they're in the chamber and their brainwaves are being recorded. And so the computer can see things that are going on that, shall we say, escape the naked eye and that escape the conscious mind. And so let's say the word is terrified, and the computer identified it as existing, even the person denied it. So then the facilitator or trainer will say, well, can you think back to something that terrified you or something that made you angry? And usually there'll be a person that shows up who did something bad or failed to do something good. Like it could be that the father was busy with his career, his business, and didn't spend time with the kid. That's very common. And so some kids handle that and develop independence, and others consider it, a big trauma, or there's sexual abuse or verbal abuse or emotional abuse. And so there's always a perpetrator. And so that person goes on the forgiveness list. And we have a 14-step forgiveness method. And as people go through and they learn how to forgive, the traumas melt away and the physiological and psychological effects of the trauma seem to disappear. And then the words don't show up on the mood scales anymore.
That's amazing. And you mentioned computers picking up things during sessions that even the naked eye can't see. And that's one of the themes that I wanted to ask you as well before we ran out of time today, of what you thought technology can bring moving forward in working with more powerful computers, more sensitive instruments. I wanted to hear your take on what's going on with technology when it comes to brain imaging or wearables or anything else that you find interesting.
Well, we have had underdeveloped two answers. We've had under development for over 5 years a new system that we call the dream system. And it will enable us to do feedback on the brainwave pattern that underlies halos. In 1996, I published a paper on the physiological basis of halos. Now, a halo is a cross-culturally recognized symbol of spiritual advancement and ethical purity. Jesus and Joseph and Mary and the apostles and angels are typically shown with halos. But it's cross-cultural because the Buddha is often depicted with a halo. Krishna in Hinduism is often depicted with a halo. And so there's a multi-decade story of my research in which I came to know a very unusual brainwave pattern, and much later learned that it was the physiological basis of halos. But it's beyond the ability of our current technology to do feedback on. It's a very complex brain pattern. But for 5 years, we've had under development the dream system, which is going to make this possible. And so perhaps this year or early next year, we'll have prototypes of this, and then we'll begin doing these trainings. But you also mentioned wearables. Now, the Biocybernaut alpha feedback training is the most powerful method that I've ever found for helping people to increase their alpha brainwaves and get all the benefits. I mean, some of the benefits of the alpha training at Biocybernaut are a 50% increase in creativity. IQ goes up an average of 11.7 points. Emotional intelligence, which is, some people say, well, the EQ researchers say it counts for about 60% of your success in life, whereas IQ is only 10 or 20%. Important, but much less important than the master skill of success, which is emotional intelligence. Men typically have lower emotional intelligence than women. In the training, here's women, here's men, both go up, and by the end of the training, there's no statistically significant difference in the emotional intelligence of men and women who've done the Alpha 1 training. The average increase is 15.8 points, which on a global basis 1 point increase in EQ nets a person $1,300 more income. And that's an average. It includes India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Eritrea, Zimbabwe, as well as Canada, Germany, England, United States. So in a first world country, the increase would likely be much larger. Well, this increase of average 15.8 points would result in an average increase in income of over $20,000 for the person in the first year, and over $400,000 over the next 20 years. So those are all, sort of side effects of doing the Biocybernaut Alpha training, along with reductions in anxiety, depression, and various forms of psychopathology. So continue. The wearable.
Yeah.
I distracted myself. So the number one effective way to do this is the Biocybernaut Alpha brainwave feedback training. But in my research, I've discovered another parameter, which, when that one is trained, is the second most effective way to increase your alpha. And this year, we will be introducing for under $500 a personal portable wearable device that uses this second parameter. And so for under $500, people will be able to make rapid progress using the second most powerful parameter to increase alpha.
Is this something that people can do from home, or what would?
Oh, yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Home, anywhere.
That's amazing. And, I think I've seen just from being on YouTube and tracking neurofeedback through wearables and that niche, it seems like so many more people are being exposed to it, which is such a good thing. I think you would agree with that. Having people have more access to being able to increase things like alpha waves to reach higher levels of consciousness. How could that be a bad thing, right?
Right, exactly.
And would you predict that training like that would make them more successful if they actually came in to do a Biocybernaut on location?
Oh, yeah. Well, like this co-founder of Canada's second largest gas company said, the ROI, the return on investment of the Biocybernaut training is 100. Mm-hmm. And my research over, more than 40 years has quantified many, many different areas, some physical performance, some mental performance, some psychological, some emotional, where the training results in massive benefits to people.
How can we move forward and inform? It sounds like you've been out at this for decades and trying to inform the mental health community. It's not a day that goes by in the news that you see concerns about mental health in America and the world at large. And there's been a heavy influence of pharmaceuticals and other means of changing the function of the brain that seem less healthy than actually being able to control your own brain waves. And what would your message be to my audience about what we can do collectively to help inform the community at large that meditation is a good thing, you can change your brain waves, and to empower people to be able to do that for themselves in their everyday lives?
Well, just recently, last year, I published a paper called The Quest for Mindfulness. Mm-hmm. It's in the British Online Journal, so it's called EC, Psychology and Psychiatry. You can go online, and for free, you can read the paper. It was published in 2019. It's called The Quest for Mindfulness, and there I review a wide variety of techniques for mindfulness. Mindfulness globally has become a multi-billion-dollar business, and there are pros and cons to different methods. I mean, meditation, for those who stick with it for 2, 3, or 4 decades, will produce amazing results. The problem with meditation is that until you get good at it, you don't get much feedback. An advanced meditator will have feedback in terms of celestial smells and visions and incredible highs in consciousness. But as any parent or teacher knows, when somebody is starting to learn, that's when they need the most feedback, because almost everything they do is wrong. And in meditation, you don't get much feedback until you are already good at it. Yeah. So it works, but it's a slow slog. Mm-hmm. But yes, it's appropriate to do that, and there a variety of techniques. This Quest for Mindfulness paper reviews the techniques for mindfulness, which is a very worthy goal. Anything you do, you can make progress, and like people typically need to move their body to get to work. Well, you can walk, or you can roller skate, or skateboard, or you can ride a bicycle, or you can go by car. And there are different costs associated with the different methods. And so, walking is cheaper than going by car.
Well, I'm so excited to, see Biocybernaut expand. I know we were talking before. You've got a wearable on the way that people can hopefully engage with, a new up and improved website that people can go to that I want to plug right here, www.biocybernaut.com, as well as anything else that's coming up that you would like people to know about? I know it sounds like you guys are expanding as well, and if you wanted to just mention that so people know what's going on with Biocybernaut in the coming months.
Well, yeah. As we expand, we'll need additional staff people for each of these locations. Now, our trainers or facilitators are often world travelers. They'll go different places, lead training. The technology with the big soundproof chambers is not easily transportable. I'm working on ways to make a transportable system that maybe next year, something like that, where we could pull into say a state fair or an army base or a college campus or a prison, and provide the training on site coming at some point.
That'd be amazing. And I really appreciate you coming on today and talking with me. I know you're a very busy man and have so much going on and so much wealth of knowledge and experience to bring people. So I'm very appreciative.
Well, you ask such incredibly good questions to pull out the deep mysteries. I especially liked your question about, well, what is it about alpha waves that enables these incredible increases in all kinds of performance? We started talking about anxiety all the way back in the 1880s, impairing performance. Alpha reduces anxiety. But in a deeper way, if I may add just one more thing to
sure.
that profound question you asked, alpha emerges in the brain only when the brain is not doing its busy work.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the brain, for example, our optic nerve sends our visual cortex 10 times more data per second than our auditory nerves send, from information coming in our ear. The information processing requirements of the data coming up the optic nerve is incredible. And so this is why meditation is done typically eyes closed. So you shut down the brain's need to do busy work. You can't be running away from a saber-toothed tiger and practicing your alpha.
Mm-hmm.
You're in fight or flight. And so that's why we do the training in soundproof rooms, dark, so that there's less burden on the brain with ordinary sensory signal processing. And so when the brain can quiet down, even to stop thinking, that's when the magic happens. Buddha said enlightenment is the space between any two mind moments. Thought, like everything else in the universe, is quantized. And normally the brain skips from one thought to another, but sometimes it falls in between this thought and the next thought, and then you have either a brief moment or an extended period of enlightenment. And so alpha helps you shut down the busy work of the brain, the thinking, the compulsive thinking, the worrying, the mind chatter, the negative voices, as well as the sensory signal processing. And so when that happens, then the great gifts of the mind can emerge. But first you have to clear out the chatter. And alpha is really good at that.
I think that's a great place to stop. Thank you so much, Dr. Hardt.
Thank you.